What's up, guys? Welcome to Roaring Podcast, where we interview experts in tech and product management, providing insights and tips on how to digitize and automate your business processes. My name is Jesper Kask, and I'm your host. E-identification, digital customer journeys, data, and customer relation ownership. In this episode, we have the pleasure of speaking to Kristofer von Beetzen, Chief Product Officer at Freja eID, about all of the above and more. If you wish to know more about Freja and their solutions, please visit frejaeid.com. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Let's dive right in. Okay, so without further ado, welcome, Kristofer. It's great to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me.
So first question that we always like to start with. What do you love the most about digitization?
Well, I would say not so much from a user perspective, since this is something each and every one of us has an experience from. I would say from a more kind of entrepreneurial or business perspective, that it has liberated so much power that if you look at the Fortune 500 companies today, most of them, or at least the biggest ones, have been started the past 10, 20 years. And that's thanks to tools that's been available now and is available for everyone. So I think the liberalization of how you can do business, now you can create new value and new companies, that's pretty amazing. And that would be kind of my 5 cents on that question.
That's a great answer. And obviously, Freja eID, where you work, is a part of this. What's the story behind the company?
Well, in short, I usually say we're the oldest startup in Stockholm because we started already back in 2002, and the focus already then was to do the digital identities for the banks. Those were the first ones that had any kind of value of digital identities. So when you were closing down your physical branches and going to online banking, you needed to identify people securely in order to manage the money. So we were a company that focused on this and provided Swedish citizens with the bank tokens, the hardware tokens that actually is still in use today. And then more and more, areas of business and public sector, etc., started to realize the need of having a secure way of identifying users. And we were in this business on the kind of technological proprietary part of the business. We made systems that banks used in Latin America, in the UK, etc., big banks and government institutions and so on. But that was like each of these organizations, they were managing their own identity. So the bank took care of their own, relation with their users with our technology. And that was basically how it looked and how it still looks in many parts of the world today. But in Sweden, we had something called Bank ID that was kind of revolutionizing the whole industry. And instead of each and every organization having their own issuance of identities, they relied on something common that the banks had issued. And then the tax authority and eHealth and businesses and others could rely on Bank ID to sort out this very important question about identities. And then around 2016, we said that, we need to jump on this train. First of all, we saw that Bank ID became a monopoly player in Sweden, and all monopolies must be challenged. That's kind of the core, vision that I have. And secondly, this is a huge business opportunity for the rest of the world. If something that is so successful here in Sweden does not almost even exist in the rest of the world, this must be something for us to look into. So we started Freja eID, launched this user-facing cloud service back in 2017. And then gradually we kind of moved away from our traditional legacy business. And finally, we sold that off, I think it was in 2020, and changed the name of the company to Freja eID. And now we're all about this cloud-based software as a service identity called Freja eID.
It's a really cool story, and obviously you're experiencing a lot of growth, which is really cool. But something that caught my attention was when you were talking about data ownership recently in a panel discussion at Stockholm FinTech Week, and I just thought that was a really interesting take on the whole issue. What's the problem with not having ownership of your data today, and what are some of the examples that we can look at?
Well, first of all, I think from a user perspective, I'm not really sure that everyone is really aware of this problem. I mean, people are sharing data left and right without really thinking too much about privacy and so on. But it's starting to become much more, discussed now and much more, on the table. Not least since GDPR, but even more, for example, when Apple launched iOS 14.5, where it suddenly became very obvious to a user that you need to choose: do you want to be tracked, do you want this data to be shared, and so on. So suddenly we have come to a situation that the users are starting to understand that, hey, my data is actually worth a lot of money, and some big tech American companies are making billions on harvesting this data. So we set out to create the service already from the beginning, because when we started to design Freja, GDPR was on the table. We knew the legislation would come in 2018. And we just said, hey, let's create a product that is aligned with GDPR. Instead of trying, as everyone else, just hide behind, long privacy, declarations that you need to sign and just try to trick the user of sharing data. We said, let's be transparent. So everything you do with Freja is basically about you as a user giving consent to everything you share. So if you identify yourself to a service, and if you need to share your email or your phone number or your address, that comes up in a pop-up and saying, you are now sharing this data with this particular service. Do you want to do that or not? And then the user can choose. And I think this has kind of set the new trend for at least in Sweden, what you should do when it comes to data sharing. And the great thing is that with this kind of transparency, people can say, well, I want to share this data with these guys, and this data I don't want to share with anybody. And if people start doing it like that, I think we can actually come to a point where data is something that you are controlling yourself. And if you have a tool to do it, then you can actually create the situation where data is something that gives you a value as a user, not only these big tech American companies.
Mm. And how does it? You mentioned in the panel discussion, I think, was Klarna was one example that you said is a problem today, that Klarna owns the business's data. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, it's not the business data. That has more to, my point with Klarna has more to do with the relation with the user. So if you think about it as it is today, you come to an e-commerce website, and they don't ask you to identify when you do your shopping, because they don't want any friction. They just want you to browse, put things in the basket, and then check out as soon as possible with as little friction as possible. And I mean, Klarna has made a great job of a frictionless checkout. It's amazing, and they also add this credit facilities and whatnot. But the problem with that is that you identify yourself to Klarna when you do the checkout, or to any other buy now, pay later company when you do the checkout. And this means that you as an e-commerce operator, does not have the direct relation to your end user, because the identification is done via a third party. And our kind of mission now, especially now when we move into e-commerce, is to tell all the e-commerce companies, you need to have a relation with your users. And that relation should start when they come to your website, such that you can identify them. They log into the loyalty club and they can see whatever loyalty points or personalized offers they have when they start shopping, not afterwards, because now they get those personalized offers from Klarna, right? And we want to just bring back that control to the e-commerce companies, who has they spent millions of getting the user to become a customer. And obviously, they want to maintain that relationship. So I think that's really key for many to understand today.
Mm. And as a provider of an eID solution, among other things, in what way are solutions like yours an important part of creating smooth digital customer journeys or whatever?
So, for example, we are, if you compare us with most other identities, I mean, in Sweden, there's not too many others to compare with. And everyone think that, bank ID is something that the United Nations provide to all people in the world. And that's kind of a human right. But it's not. It's a private solution. It's great. It's issued by the banks on certain conditions. But they are basing their identity on the social security number or the personnummer, as we call it in Sweden, where we are kind of creating an identity for the individual. And then the social security number is one of the attributes. Your email address or email addresses are attributes, your phone number, your postal address. It can be a variety of things. We even have the COVID vaccination data as attributes. We can add, an infinite number of attributes to you as a user, which means that when you come to do a user onboarding, let's say you are a Freja user, you're registered, you have the data in Freja, you come to a e-commerce site, let's say, and they say, okay, register as a loyalty customer and you get 20% on your first purchase. Continue with Freja. Like that, you share all that data you need to share to become a member or a customer, including the GDPR consent, including the legally binding signature of accepting their terms, etc. Instead of first identifying, create the password, and then you should remember your grandmother's cat name next time you forget your password, and then you should enter your phone number, and then you should enter your address. That's a cumbersome process. We want to get rid of that. We want onboarding to be as easy as just clicking on Freja and giving the consent in one go.
Yeah. And why is it important to have several options? You mentioned sort of bank ID as a bigger player today. Why is it important to have several options available in the market?
Well, I think first of all, we should not forget that we have now become, at least if we look in Sweden, we have become dependent on electronic identities. There's over 5,000 different services that are requiring you to have an eID to enter those services and to do any kind of business. And that's services like Swish, the national infrastructure for mobile payments. It's accessing your e-health, taxes authority, e-commerce, you name it. If bank ID is down, even for just a few hours, which happened, not so long ago, just a few weeks ago, for a few hours, then, Sweden stops. If you don't have a redundancy option, you are losing money. I mean, if you are, let's say, if you're just imagine this situation, you're a day trader on the stock market. You have gone short on some position on the stock market, and then you go for a lunch. And then your eID suddenly doesn't work for 3 hours in the afternoon. You see this stock market is dipping and your position is going haywire. You lose $1 million just because you couldn't identify yourself to your stock trading service. That's just one extreme example, but not to have redundancy when we are dependent on eID is crazy. So that's for the kind of redundancy purpose. The other thing is that we need to offer eID to everyone. They're still up around, there's no exact number, but they say that's around 1 million Swedish people do not have an eID. And some cannot get bank ID for different reasons and so on. And some of these people can get Freja. So we need to think about including everyone. I mean, the services that are, amazing for you and me, we can so easily log in somewhere with our eID. If you don't have an eID, try to manage a few days in Sweden without it. It's horrible. So we need to think about all these people that are not included in the digitalization. They need to be in on this journey as well. And the only way to do that is to have several options. We can't just expect that one operator will fix it for everyone. It doesn't happen in any other industry. So that's why we need to take responsibility for redundancy and for including everyone.
And is there a risk as well with bank ID being a product of the banks? Is there a risk that they could just choose what they want to do with it, so to speak, or is there a problem there as well?
Yeah, so I think not, but I think not in particular because they are banks, because the banks are doing a great job when it comes to security and compliance. They have, one of the most regulated industries in the world. So when it comes to security and compliance, the banks are doing, a great job. But this is also creating a problem in issuing eIDs. So if you are a bank, then you cannot issue a bank account to anyone. There are certain regulations they need to follow in order for someone to open a bank account. And if you can't have a bank account, you can't have a bank ID. And that creates a lot of problems. So we cannot just demand from the banks that everyone should have an eID, because then they will be violating other regulations in relations to how they open a bank account. So I think that the banks are trying as hard as they can, but it's impossible for them to accommodate everyone in a situation like this. And I don't think it's fair either to just expect the banks to solve it. The bottom line is this is actually a responsibility from the government. So the government should make sure that we have eID solutions for everyone. We're trying to do as best as we can. Bank ID is trying their best. And if there's, a gap somewhere, in the end, it needs to be kind of a government responsibility to make sure that either a private operator like us, fills those gaps, or they offer something from the kind of public sector side.
Yeah. And you mentioned sort of the use of eID in creating a really smooth sign up or onboarding or checkout solution. Where should you start if you want to use eID to improve a specific business process? Where's the normal sort of low-hanging fruits in companies today?
Well, I think it has been mostly driven by compliance. For example, the banks, that they needed to securely identify their users. They have regulations around that. And then it came to the gambling industry. We had the new gambling regulation in Sweden a few years ago, where you're required to onboard your users with a approved eID. And now there's coming other regulations. So there is a proposition from the Swedish government that from the 1st of January, all the checkouts in e-commerce should be verified with an approved electronic identity. So these regulations are coming from all over the place now. But if you think about it, I think that the worst enemy to customer, onboarding, to user acquisition, and to retention, at least from my personal, point of view, is passwords. I try to keep this security standard that you shouldn't have the same password on different sites and so on. So I keep forgetting these passwords. And then I'm like, if it's not super important, then I might not take the time required to do the password reset. And then someone is losing business. If you have an eID, you probably never forget your password. You have one ID that you can access everything with. And that's smoothness. I mean, who wouldn't want a smoother onboarding process? Having passwords in your user flow, it's like having, if let's say you're a physical store, a physical retail store, you try to get in the door, and then someone is standing there and say, hey, give me your secret code. I forgot it. I need to go home and get it. Oh, sorry. I mean, you just open the doors for your customers. It should be the same online. Just open the doors, and behind the scenes, all this compliance technology and security is happening without the user even have to kind of bother with it. It's pretty magical, and I'm surprised that businesses are not more looking into onboarding and retention. That's where really eID can help you a lot.
And what other parts are crucial in your point of view when it comes to user acquisition or sign up or customer onboarding besides the eID?
Well, I think it's become pretty obvious to everyone right now. Again, with the iOS 14.5, as I mentioned, but also Facebook stating a few months ago, we are not allowing you to target individuals under 18 on any other, personal information than the age, not about interest, user behavior, and so on. Google is stopping third-party cookies from next year. It's already been stopped in several browsers. It's becoming increasingly difficult to reach out to new customers online. And I think the problem has arisen because these big tech companies, perhaps not Apple then, but most big tech companies have not treated the personal data as well as you've been expecting them to. GDPR was one way of doing it. It really didn't fly too much for that particular vector, at least. And now there's coming new EU regulations. It's making it harder and harder to make your user acquisition online. And what we've been doing in Freja is saying like, hey, we now have 600,000 users, and they are interacting with Freja and our service partners with consent. So we can actually help you to connect with our users with consent as the core feature of this. And I think if you look at eID like that, and you start, you start interacting with the users based on consent and transparency, then you can have a totally new and unique way of getting in touch with those users who are, increasingly difficult to reach via the social media platforms, as we can see today.
That's super. What would you leave the listeners with as we're coming up on time? Is there any particular tip or insight that you want to share that you think would be good for everyone to have with them?
Well, I would just start to look outside of our borders. I mean, we are now in a situation where cyber attacks might become an increasing problem for us. So make sure to, first of all, not base your business operations on 19th century or 20th century solutions like username and password. The security just does not do it. So move away from that, look into an eID, and make sure that you have redundancy. Offer your users variety and choice. That gives you redundancy, and that gives you inclusiveness as well. So that would be my recommendation, because when you do, then you will find there's so many opportunities opening up in terms of user onboarding, frictionless user interaction and customer retention.
Super. And as we're touching upon that subject, we didn't really get into the whole Russia discussion and all that deep. But have you seen an increase in the interest of your service based on the fact that there's an overhanging threat of Russians potentially? Let's say, for example, that they perform a cyber attack and bank ID shuts down. Have you seen an increase in the interest in your services based upon that?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of that both from public sector and private sector, they realize the need for redundancy, because everyone can actually see quite clearly if your service is down for a few hours or even a few days, the money you're losing, is not even, equivalent or comparable to the cost of having Freja for a full year. So I think everyone or quite a lot of people are starting to see that logic now. And then I think the other thing is that more and more are starting to realize that, we need to include everyone. The inclusiveness is really, really important. Everyone is talking about sustainability, but they're missing out that there's almost 1 million people in Sweden who cannot, do basic things online. And if you want to be sustainable, make sure that you have choice in your electronic identity so that everyone who wants to join you can join you. I mean, from a fairness perspective, it's great, but also from a business perspective, these are also customers, and you should do what you can to include them.
Yeah, I love that. That's great, Kristofer. Thank you so much for joining us. It was great having you on, and I hope to see you soon again.
Thank you so much.
You've been listening to an episode of a Roaring podcast by Roaring.io. Feel free to share it with your friend, colleague, or peer if you liked it. If you wish to stay connected to us, don't forget to subscribe to the show. Thanks for tuning in. Until next time.